Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So we're back after that little break, working our way through this final chapter, the intertwining, the chiasm. And I thought it would be a good idea to just review quickly what we went through in the last video, because this video does really follow on directly from and kind of continue our investigation into this key question. So the question that we asked ourselves in the last video was, how is it that our gaze, in enveloping the thing from a distance, at the same time unveils it while appearing to leave it in its place, such that the vision we acquire of it seems to come from it? And we explored this question in the last video by looking at the two sides of experience, the seen and the seer. And the result that we came to was that was this idea of a visible appearing on an invisible milieu. And this we called the flesh of the thing. And then we discussed the two meanings of the intertwining. Revealing must also be capable of being revealed, and the way that the senses interwove with each other, rather than being disparate kind of takes on some fixed reality. And in this video, we basically want to continue delving into this question, putting those insights together to give a fuller answer to this question. And basically, that is going to bring us to the first part of the video, which is flesh. So the secret to answering our question, how is it that as our gaze envelops the thing, at the same nevertheless, the thing appears as something separate from us, as something independent of us, such that the vision we have of it seems to come from it rather than from us? How do we reconcile these two aspects? And the secret to answering this question, I think, lies in the notion of distance. Specifically, we want to know here what this word means in the context of Merleau-Ponty's inquiry into being. So we'll start with a quote. "We understand then why we see the things themselves in their places where they are, according to their being, which is indeed more than their being perceived, and why at the same time we are separated from them by all the thickness of the look and of the body. It is that this distance is not the contrary of this proximity. It is deeply consonant with it. It is synonymous with it. It is that the thickness of flesh between the seer and the thing is constitutive for the thing of its visibility, as for the seer of his corporeity. It is not an obstacle between them. It is their means of communication." So we discussed distance a couple of videos back when we talked about language. But the distance here that Merleau-Ponty is talking about is created, he says, by the thickness of the look and of the body. And the thickness, the way I understand the word thick here, is that it interjects space or distance. It creates some kind of distance between us and the thing. And that's what I think he means by the word thickness. There's a distance that created between me as seer and the thing as seen. And this space, or this distance, Merleau-Ponty calls flesh. And this is flesh as body. So in the last video, we talked about flesh as the invisible milieu on which the visible thing appears. Here, the thickness of flesh between the seer and the thing, which allows both the visibility of the thing and the corporeity of the seer, refers to the body. And this is flesh. So there are two things to note about this. First, the thickness, the distance, is constitutive for the thing and for the seer. So that's important. Remember what we talked about in an earlier video, the visible present, which was not the seer plus the seen, but the thing seen. And it was that which was originary. The visible present, in a way, preceded the seer and the seen, because those two things, those two abstractions, arose out of it. So that visible present was originary. It wasn't seer or seen, but thing seen. And the thickness, well, again, the distance here is precisely what enables this visible present, the thing seen. And again, out of which arises the thing as visible and the seer as corporeal body. So that's the connection there. This thickness is what is the generative force, if you like, which enables the visible present, the thing seen, and which is therefore constitutive for the thing as the seen, and for me, if you like, as the seer. So that was the first point. The second point is that this thickness of the flesh, that is the body, is not the body as a lump of matter. It's not the physical body, but the body as sensible for itself and exemplar sensible. The thickness of the body, far from rivaling that of the world, is on the contrary the sole means I have to go unto the heart of the things. The body interspersed is not itself a thing, an interstitial matter, a connective tissue, but a sensible for itself, which means not that absurdity, colour that sees itself, surface that touches itself, but a set of colours and surfaces inhabited by a touch, a vision, hence an exemplar sensible, which offers to him who inhabits it and senses it the wherewithal to sense everything that resembles himself on the outside. So the body is in the world like other things, but it's not a thing like them. It's not merely an interstitial matter or connective tissue. It's not an object that connects a seer with something to be seen. Rather, it is, as Merleau-Ponty says, a sensible for itself. And that's a really important expression. It's a set of colours and surfaces, my body, in my physical body, inhabited by a touch, a vision. A sensible, that is, despite this fact, despite the fact that it is, that I am a sensible thing in the world, not the same as other sensible things, because it's also capable of seeing, of opening up a perspective. And the other expression Merleau-Ponty uses there, calling the body an exemplar sensible, which is to say, like the model or the best example of a sensible thing. I think it's interesting to think about why he uses that expression, why he goes that far. And I think the reason is it changes our way of thinking. So human beings aren't over and above worldly, sensible things, nor are we fundamentally different from them in a kind of mind versus matter dualism. Instead, we are the principal example of a sensible thing. We're the sensible thing par excellence. That's, I think, the way to think about this. We're not something completely different. We're not outside of the sensible. In fact, we are the best example of what a sensible thing is. We're the most sensible thing. We're the most physical thing. We're the perfect example of what a sensible thing is. Rather than, this is the opposite to how we normally think of it, right? We think of things like tables and chairs. They are perfect examples of the the sensible, and we are different. We are in some way outside of that category. But Merleau-Ponty is saying, no, we are in that category, but we are the best example of that kind of sensible thing. And that's a nice way of changing the way we think about this, so that we understand ourselves as truly being in the world with these other sensible things as one of them, but as this best example, this sensible thing par excellence. And there's an asterisk comment on page 135 where Merleau-Ponty says the unpresentability is the flesh. And that just, I think, is further support for this idea that the body as flesh is not a thing, but a sensible for itself. It has this extra depth to it. So now we have then, I think, a fuller picture of flesh. It's both that invisible milieu that we talked about in the last video, but it's also the body as distance or sensible for itself, the thickness of the body. And I've emphasized this double aspect of flesh before, body and world, and talked about the way that flesh is being used as a metaphor, which allows us to grasp how we, as body, and how the world in which things appear are connected. And that this is the chiasm into a whole without merging into one thing. But if we think about it even further here, this double aspect, what I've called the double aspect of flesh, body and world, the body is sensible for itself in that invisible milieu, these two aspects aren't actually two different things at all. Rather, the body as distance is a part of this invisible milieu. It's just another way of thinking about it. So I think that's my take on the flesh anyway, as Merleau-Ponty explains it here. So the next part of the video is visibility. Okay, the intertwining refers to the body as both seer and thing seen, that is, as a sensible for itself, a set of colours and surfaces inhabited by a touch or a vision, as Merleau-Ponty called it. And earlier in the book, he calls these, earlier, like a page earlier, I think, he calls these two aspects two leaves, the sentient and the sensible. But he wants to expand on and really go beyond this now. There are not in it, the body, two leaves or two layers. Fundamentally, it is neither things seen only nor seer only. It is visibility, sometimes wandering and sometimes reassembled. It sees the world itself, the world of everybody, and without having to leave itself, because it is holy, because its hands, its eyes are nothing else than this reference of a visible. So this idea of visibility, I think it's important to understand this in order to fully understand what Merleau-Ponty means by the body. So the body's not just a thing seen or a seer, or both combined in some way. We've already talked about this. And even at its most fundamental, it's not a sensible for itself. Although we can, of course, call it this, we can describe it in this way and gain some understanding from that description. Rather, the body is fundamentally integrated and immersed in the whole itself, the whole that is being, to which Merleau-Ponty gives the new name here, visibility. So there are three things that I think are worth clarifying at this point. The first is, and they're all related to the way that Merleau-Ponty is talking about the body here. So the first thing he calls it the sensible for itself, the body as sensible for itself. And in doing that, it helps us to understand how the body is different from other things in the world. How the body it's a part of the world, but it's not the same as, it's not identical with other parts of the world. It is, and this is also the use of how the use of the expression exemplar, sensible, fits in here, because this gives us this idea that we're not just a thing like other things. We are a thing like other things, but we're the best example of a thing, and that's captured as in the sense of the body as sensible for itself. Another word that Merleau-Ponty's been using here is flesh, so calling body and the world flesh, and this helps us see how they are connected. So the sensible for itself gives us this sense of how we are different from the world and things in it. Flesh gives us the sense that we're connected. It lets us understand how we're connected, nevertheless, with other things in the world and in the world itself. And now we've got this visibility. So Merleau-Ponty's calling the body visibility here. He's calling the body visibility. But I think he means this more broadly to be body and world. So the same as flesh. But then why make a new word? Why throw in this new word, which is actually a little bit awkward as well? It's a strange word to use to describe this. So there are two reasons that stand out for me. The first is the word visibility as capacity for vision, I think preserves the sense of possibility or potentiality that is central to flesh. Remember in the last video we talked about the latency, that we talked about flesh as a prototype for being. And we spent a lot of time talking about the difference between visibles. That was the key which allowed visibles to appear in the first place. So all of those ways of thinking carry with them this idea of possibility, potentiality. And visibility captures that. It preserves that for us. So that's the first reason. The second reason I think using the word visibility instead of flesh is useful is that it helps us understand that this originary situation, the whole, is not a thing. Meaning that it's not something that can be expressed in positive terms. And we've talked about this a lot, especially towards the beginning of the series. When we want to grasp something, we have to fit it into concepts. We have to apply labels. We have to use words. But ontology as Merleau-Ponty's describing it here, resists all of this. It doesn't fit into these neat concepts and categories that we establish. It's not something positive about which we can. It's not something like other ideas we have where we can specify something and then go on to describe attributes about it. It resists this way of thinking because it's not itself a thing. As the origin for all things, it itself can't be a thing. So when Merleau-Ponty equates flesh with visibility, sometimes wandering as a seer, as an opening upon the world, as a perspective, sometimes reassembled as seen, as a thing in the world, we feel a kind of dissonance because we were expecting a thing. We were expecting some kind of positive term as a description of being, to clarify for us what being is. How can being be visibility? It doesn't make sense. that word just doesn't apply. The visibility means the capacity for vision. How can being be this thing, which isn't even a thing? It's something that things have, right? Things have the capacity for vision or the capacity to be seen, but that itself can't be ontological bedrock. But that's what Merleau-Ponty's saying it is. That's his point. Calling flesh visibility doesn't make sense, and this is his way of short-circuiting that analytical approach, which can only understand positive concepts and explicit things, that thinks in those kinds of terms. And I'm reminded actually of a comment someone left once, which said, but what is being? Just tell me what it is. Give it to me in a sentence. But it's just not that kind of thing to understand what being is, what flesh is, what visibility is. There's just so much to it that it can't just be succinctly wrapped up in a single proposition. It doesn't have that, it doesn't fit into our conceptual framework in that way. You can, of course, give us a simple statement or sentence, but it's not going to make any sense to someone who hasn't done the background work, who hasn't followed through with all of Merleau-Ponty's thoughts here. You just end up with an expression that really doesn't mean anything to you. Like being is visibility. Doesn't mean anything unless you've unpacked what that word means, and there's a whole lot of work that goes into it. But that's why the word visibility is so useful if you've laid the groundwork anyway. So next, Merleau-Ponty gives a nice description of vision and touch, bringing together his notions of the body as sensible for itself and visibility. There is vision, touch, when a certain visible, a certain tangible, turns back upon the whole of the visible, the whole of the tangible of which it is a part, or when suddenly it finds itself surrounded by them, or when between it and them and through their commerce is formed a visibility, a tangible in itself, which belongs properly neither to the body qua fact, nor to the world qua fact. So actual vision or touch occur when a certain visible or tangible, i.e. the human being, the human body, has its attention directed to the whole of the visible or tangible of which it is a part, i.e. the world, and a specific visible or tangible is then experienced, i.e. in their quote, a visibility or tangible in itself. And that's I think, another way of understanding how Merleau-Ponty thinks about us as being a part of the world and yet being able at the same time to turn back on that world, to see ourselves as surrounded by this world, and then through that a visible comes into being. And one other point about that, Merleau-Ponty talks about vision and touch only, but that's because I think his idea is more clearly expressed in these modalities. It's easier to see what he's getting at through the modalities of vision and touch. He could, I think, just as correctly have said audibility or smellability or tasteability, but the awkwardness of those last two really demonstrate, I think, why Merleau-Ponty chose vision and touch. And in general, we could say perceptibility, I think, instead of visibility or tangibility. But again, those two particular sensory modalities just capture the idea that Merleau-Ponty is getting at really well, and that's why I think he focuses on them so much. Okay, let's move into the third part, which is the narcissism in vision. Right, so what does Merleau-Ponty mean by this narcissism in vision? Two things, actually. The first meaning of narcissism refers to the way that vision requires a commerce between a seer and a thing, in which, as we've seen, neither pre-exist the result or the product of this relation, the thing seen. However, the seer is inevitably caught up in what they see. Inevitably, the seer is the thing that is seen as appearing from the opening that is me. It's seen from this perspective upon the world. So it unavoidably refers back to a certain perspective. And so there's a clear narcissistic element to vision there. The thing that is seen inevitably refers back to the seer, the origin of the perspective. But there's a second and more profound sense of the narcissism, Merleau-Ponty says. For the same reason, the vision the seer, exercises, he also undergoes from the things, such that, as many painters have said, I feel myself looked at by the things. My activity is equally passivity. Not to see in the outside, as the others see it, the contour of a body one inhabits, but especially to be seen by the outside, to exist within it, to emigrate into it, to be seduced, captivated, alienated by the phantom, so that the seer and the visible reciprocate one another, and we no longer know which sees and which is seen. It is this visibility, this generality of the sensible in itself, this anonymity innate to myself that we have previously called flesh, and one knows there is no name in traditional philosophy to designate it. So, okay, how is this narcissism, first of all? It's narcissism because I feel myself to be the object, the focus of things around me. Their attention is drawn to me as this center point, this focal center point. So there's a narcissistic element to it in that sense. And this second sense of the narcissism in vision captures the fact then that I am, in addition to a seeing, I'm also a seen, a visible. And in fact, the only reason I can be a seeing is because I'm also a visible, a seen. But this is why we can, as some painters have said, according to Merleau-Ponty, we can feel ourselves to be the visible object of things. Not literally, of course, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. So then there is this sense of passivity to my seeing. I am the seer, I'm the perspective, but there is this strange sense of reciprocity in which I'm no longer the acting force. Instead there's a force acting upon me. I become passive in my activity. So there are a couple of things to say about this. First, this passivity answers Merleau-Ponty's question about why the thing appears in its place, as if it were separate or independent from me. And that's because of this intrinsic reciprocity, this passivity that is a part of vision or touch or sensing, that is caused by the fact that I'm also visible, tangible, and sensible. this fact that I'm also in the world, even as I take up a perspective on the world. And secondly, just thinking about what this passivity means, what we can say about it. And one thing we can say is that it blurs the boundary, and Merleau-Ponty does say this, it blurs the boundary between seer and seen, between perceiver and perceived. So I am, as he says, seduced, captivated, alienated by the world which I exist within. That distinction between who is the seer and what is the seen becomes ambiguous, unclear. And another thing we can say about this passivity is that it's marked by generality and anonymity. And these are important themes that have been with Merleau-Ponty right from the beginning. The generality he talks about is the generality of the sensible in itself, or visibility, or flesh. And there is this generality because it's prior to any particular sensible or visible. It's what makes any particular sensible or visible, that particular sensible or visible that they are. So it's prior to them, and in that sense it must be general. It can't be a specific individual. So that's the generality. And then we have the anonymity as well, and this comes from the fact that flesh is prior to and a constituent part of the myself that is the seer. So prior to there being a me as seer, something I identify with as myself, there is this anonymous flesh out of which that sense of myself arises. So I like this idea too. This is where passivity leads us to this sense of that the deeper we go when we're trying to understand being, we come across something which precedes the specific individual facts that we usually take to be real and that we identify with, including the self. Prior to all of this, there is a general, anonymous field, if you like, and out of that we get these particular things: the thing itself, the self, me as a self. These things arise out of that. So passivity, I think, is a really important part of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy. Okay, and this brings us to the last part of the video, which is flesh as element. So earlier in the last section, at the end of the quote, Merleau-Ponty says, this visibility we've called flesh, and there is no name in traditional philosophy to designate it. So he wants to give a name, however, and the name that he comes up with is this word element. The flesh is not matter in the sense of corpuscles of being which would add up or continue on one another to form beings. Nor is the visible, the things as well as my own body, some psychic material that would be, God knows how, brought into being by the things factually existing and acting on my factual body. In general, it is not a fact or a sum of facts, material or spiritual. The flesh is not matter, is not mind, is not substance. To designate it, we should need the old term element, in the sense it was used to speak of water, air, earth, and fire. That is, in the sense of a general thing, midway between the spatio-temporal individual and the idea. A sort of incarnate principle that brings a style of being wherever there is a fragment of being. The flesh is, in this sense, an element of being. Okay, nice. So the word that Merleau-Ponty is using here is element. Before we get too far into that, though, this also addresses what I said earlier in the last section about the way that when Merleau-Ponty is talking about we're seen by things, we have this sense of becoming visible for things around us. And I said that's not literally the case. That's just how we feel. So there is then a temptation to go kind of spiritual or mystical here, invoking something along the lines of panpsychism maybe. Things are actually in some strange way or some way specific to them. They are themselves seers actually, so everything has this capacity for whatever. There is that possibility that it's possible to go down a path like that. And I think this quote kind of squashes that idea. Flesh isn't matter, but nor is it psychic. Both material and spiritual ways of trying to understand flesh are too superficial because they both try to pin flesh down as something. That is, some substance, a concept, an idea, a positive word that we can talk about with a sense of clarity and precision. We already know that's not what flesh is. Flesh cannot be that kind of thing. So to say that it is an idea, it's consciousness, that's another something else that's become kind of popular recently. These are attempts to pin being down, to make it understandable using positive terms and concepts. That is illegitimate. It's not going to get you to what being ultimately is. It's not going to get you to a full understanding of the ontological foundation that Merleau-Ponty is looking for. In fact, we already know flesh is inexpressible because as soon as you express it, you are in fact in it. And you can only express it because you're already in it. So that expression itself is already a part of flesh and therefore can't capture what flesh is, at least not in this clear positivistic sense. And we talked about this in earlier videos as well. So anyway, Merleau-Ponty says if we insist on a word to describe flesh, well, he doesn't say that, but if we do insist on a word, Merleau-Ponty suggests element. And I think he has in mind here, so he references water, air, earth, and fire as the way that element was understood in the old days, the old term he calls it. And I think what he has in mind maybe is something like Empedocles, who saw these four elements as basically the constituent parts of everything. So everything in the world is made up of these four elements. But these four elements themselves then aren't specific things because they make up things. So there is again this inexpressibility attached to them, this sense that we can't pin down exactly what they are because they make up everything that is. In constituting everything that is, whatever positive term we come up with has already invoked them. So they're already a part of things. They themselves are not things. And this then gives us this sense of being or flesh as something general. There's that word again, linked to passivity, anonymity. So flesh as element is nothing in and of itself. It's nothing sensible, a spatiotemporal individual, as Merleau-Ponty says. or mental, as in an idea. Not something, I think, not an actual thought here, but idea as in cogito or mind. Rather than something sensible or something mental, it is something midway, a kind of style that conditions or shapes whatever things or ideas form. And that's a really important word in Merleau-Ponty that, again, has been with him since Phenomenology of Perception at least, the idea of style. So rather than an actual thing we can express and get our conceptual mitts into, flesh is a style. It conditions, it shapes, it influences the things or ideas that eventually appear. So in this sense, it is rather than a fact, it's more like the possibility and exigency for a fact. It is, again, Merleau-Ponty, facticity, by which he means what makes the fact be a fact, as well as that which gives facts meaning. So all of this is bound up with the way that Merleau-Ponty talks about flesh as element. And at the end there, he says flesh is an element of being. But he definitely doesn't mean there it's a part of being. Rather, he means that flesh as element is being. And that seems like a pretty good place to finish. So let's have a look at a summary. So first up was flesh. And the key idea here is distance. And this is the thickness of the look and of the body. It's this which allows both the visibility of the thing and the corporeity of the seer. Remember what we talked about there with the thing seen, and out of that thing, that thing seen is originary, and out of that comes the thing and the seer. But what enables that thing seen in the first place is this distance, this thickness of the look and of the body. And in fact, that's how I think we have to understand the word thick here, thickness, as in creating distance, creating that space. And another key word is the body. And Merleau-Ponty describes the body as sensible for itself, to remind us that despite being a sensible, we're not reducible to or only a sensible. And he also describes it as an exemplar sensible. So the sensible thing par excellence, to remind us that we're not a different kind of thing, but the best example of a thing. We are a thing. We are sensible things. We belong to that category. But we're the most, if you like, perfect example of a sensible thing. And here we also talked about flesh as, this gave us a kind of fuller picture of flesh as the invisible milieu and the body, but the body as distance, as sensible for itself. But we went a little bit further too and said that instead of there being these two aspects to flesh, these are actually the same thing. The body is distance and the invisible milieu, they are actually different ways of talking about the same thing. Then we looked at visibility, and this is another term for flesh. But the importance of this word was that it preserves the sense of potentiality in flesh. Flesh is not a particular thing. Rather, it's the potential for all things. And this was one important, I think, term here is difference, which we talked about in the last video. The invisible milieu, visibility, flesh, it's all characterized by difference rather than identity. Characterized by the potential for, if we were Deleuze, we'd say something like conflict or chaos, and out of those interactions we get things. Invisibility also reminds us that flesh is not a positive thing. To say flesh is visibility, it doesn't make sense. It literally doesn't make conceptual, logical sense. And this is because visibility can't be a thing, and we expect an answer in terms of things. We expect a positive term because that's what we understand. That's the only way we can get conceptual clarity, is through some kind of positive expression. But that's not what flesh is. It's not what ontology is for Merleau-Ponty. Then we moved on to the narcissism in vision. In the first sense here, the thing is always seen from a perspective. So a perspective which is me. Things that are there for me. They refer to me. There's a natural sense of narcissism there. But the second sense, the more profound sense, was the passivity that we saw in vision. So such that I feel I am seen by things. I become a thing for other things. And the narcissism here is that I become the focal point. Or at least I feel myself to be the focal point. And what this does is it blurs the boundary between seer and seen. There is a natural reciprocity there. Again, a reciprocity that we feel, that not that there is an actual reciprocity. Things aren't actually seeing me, but that's the sense. And that comes with visibility, with seeing. In order to see, I must have this, I must be capable of feeling this sense that I am also seen. So the passivity in vision is an intrinsic, essential part of vision, of the active sense of vision. So when I'm seeing, a part of what it is to see, a part of what it means to be able to see, is that I can feel there's a reciprocity there. I can feel myself seen. And another important thing here was that the vision, or the passivity in vision, is marked by generality and anonymity. And these two words go right to the core of being for Merleau-Ponty. There is this generality to flesh because it's prior to any particular sensible or visible. And there's also an anonymity because it's prior to any self as a seer. And finally, we looked at flesh as element. So basically here, flesh is nothing sensible or mental. Rather, it's a style which conditions or shapes things and ideas. So this is really, I think, as I mentioned, a reference to Empedocles, perhaps, whose four elements combined to form all of the things that we see and that we touch and that we know. It is, in fact, that which forms everything, but therefore is itself nothing, as in no thing, not a particular thing, not anything we can talk about, we can get any kind of conceptual clarity regarding. And that's us for today. So there are going to be 2 more videos with this, and then we will call it for this series in this book. So hopefully that helped. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.